one of these two moves. Hikaru played A5 just as I was going to explain to chat. You've got the same feeling as me. Just as I was going to explain to chat, you know, Keddy and I already at this stage in the end game with these dark squared bishops, you're not going to find us like sticking our pawns on dark squares. We're only going to put pawns on light squares at this point. So that's why we're not talking about A5. But okay, he played it.
He played it. Actually, it makes sense because after A6, I don't know about C6, but you allow white to get more space advantage on the queen side. So maybe you don't want to do that. And C7 can be a weakness then at some point. So it makes sense that he's fighting for the space and he is not worried about the bishop. Bishop is just open on the other diagonal.
Okay, so A5 from Hikaru holding the space. And of course, Wesley's queen side can be vulnerable as it advances. Even if the pawns are on light squares, they can be vulnerable either to the black knight or the black rook. So as long as it's not a pure bishop ending, this pawn structure of Wesley's has some real problems in it. In a pure bishop ending, it won't really be an issue, but otherwise it will be. So, all right, we need to explain two more moves that have come in here. H4 from Wesley, gaining space again. I think maybe with the idea of putting the pawn on H5 and leaving H6 as a long-term weakness. And now Hikaru's played the C6 move that we were kind of.
Oh my God, bishop E5 wins now a game because you can't take rook E5, knight D7 loses whatever, like everything. Bishop is hanging, rook is hanging, and the check. Yeah. And if you take by the pawn, then D6, you attack the rook. And how you're going to stop knight D7?
Oh, so when you save the rook, that's the only square for the rook, then knight D7. So C6, well, it wasn't as bad a blunder when I suggested it because the bishop was defended, maybe, but I definitely didn't check this bishop takes E5 move. Let's go back. Bishop E5 played by Wesley.
What?
And this is like the 27,2800 level version of a blunder, I guess.
Oh no, if he loses this game, that's over.
Yeah.
Please. Why?
Sorry.
He did that.
Might not be an Armageddon here. I know Wesley didn't convert a positional advantage last game, but this
is too much.
Looks
like you have extra piece.
Like a position that you will never save against Wesley. A knight against one pawn in the end game. If it weren't Wesley, I wouldn't say it's over. These end games can be tricky, but Wesley is probably pretty dead here.
Piece. No way.
F3, nice clean move, stopping E4 from black. The hope for black in this kind of endgame is a lot of pawn trades.
Yeah, starting maybe B5.
H5 or B5?
This A5, you see how bad is that move? It's hanging now.
If B5, then knight takes A5. B5's no good. B5's no good because knight A5, you can only take one pawn on A4, then knight C6, also hitting E5. Maybe H5 here to try and trade a pawn on the fourth rank.
Yeah, can be possible. King F, actually the pawn on E5 was hanging, so here we had King F6, maybe B3 just to guard A4, pawn, attack A5. You cannot even play B6 there anymore. You have to play rook D5.
Oh, you got it. B3. I would encourage our viewers to entertain themselves the remainder of this game by playing Guess the Move. See if you can come up with Wesley's moves. See if you've got what it takes to convert an extra piece against the world's elite, because it's not guaranteed. I'm sure Hikaru would gladly beat a lot of us in this endgame down a night and then laugh about it. So see if you've got Keddy and Wesley's instincts here to go B3, supporting that A pawn. Now with knight A5 to C6 coming, well, I've called that.
Yeah, you know what's worse here for Hikaru? It's still rapid apportion. It's not a blitz with 2 seconds on the board. It is 10 seconds of increment. So there's no point to flag here with white, and you have for this position, Wesley has 4 minutes. That's more than enough.
There's H5. It's important how we choose to handle this. By the way, I'll say that A takes B5. I was going to say it, but then the moves came so fast. A takes B5 is preferable here over knight A5, C6, like in the other position. And the reason is that after you trade that way, you're left with pawns that are on the same file. The person trying to win usually wants pawns to be on the same file because there's no ways to offer the pawn trade. And you can eventually maneuver around, and it gives you another target on B5 that you can try to win to use your extra piece. And the person trying to defend endgames would always want like a C pawn versus a B pawn, or an A pawn versus a B pawn, so they can try to trade the pawns that way.
Yeah, to have the opposite. So H5 was quite tricky move there, David, because if you play King G3, then H takes, F takes, and E4 is a move. So Wesley spotted there. He took the pawn on H5 first. Although now Rook F1 is still the move. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, he sets up a pair of pawns that are on the same file, that are sort of locked and blocked by each other, and that gives him something else to work with to try and eventually win the game, is going after the H5 pawn as well. So lots of room for Wesley to win this endgame eventually, but still has the problem of the passive rook stuck defending this pawn. I think also part of the G takes H choice is it leaves him with the F3 pawn to stop any potential E4 moves.
Yeah, maybe Black has to play at some point F5 and D4 to trade it. Rook D6 has been played here.
Yeah, that's to keep this knight in a weird situation on A5. And
you can play here knight B7 with white. Knight C5 and B4.
Then he would just come back to D5, and the knight on B7 would still sort of have no square but A5. Okay, so B4 is played, and King F5 quickly from Hikaru, which is one of the things he's got to do in this kind of situation, is he's got to play really quickly because he just can't give his opponent time.
No.
Try and put some pressure.
With this maneuvering here before knight C5, that's what white wants, that he would like to free the rook. So D3 pawn will be guarded, and black now can hit the pawn on B4, but I think knight has more active position there and more space.
Yeah, that's going to become somewhat easier for Wesley when the knight gets to C5. I wonder why in this position Hikaru didn't try rook D4. With the idea of knight C6, rook back to D6, and just boop, 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 boop.
Maybe knight E7 there to attack on B5. Rook D5, and then you can free your rook and go away.
Knight over to here, huh? And now you'd be ready, if the rook defends the pawn, you'd be ready to, switch your rook to B1 or C1 or something and try to use this B pawn. Okay, that sounds good to me. Let's see what's happening. King F5, knight B3, knight C, knight goes back to A5. Okay.
Oh, whoa. This is 2 times repetition. Or not. King was on G3.
King was on G3.
Yeah, okay.
I think the king's coming here to try to free the rook, but there's still rook D4 in this position, attacking these 2 pawns. What's the plan? What's the plan? There goes an H pawn. Can you believe that white's up a knight and they've lost a pawn over the last 6-7 moves?
Well,
I guess
Hikaru, he's so tricky.
I know. He's just working with one rook, Oh, and Wesley trades the pawn. I was just going to say, I guess rook C1 to C5 probably still wins here. But D4, okay. If the pawns trade,
this pawn, the knight comes on D4, and then B5 pawn will be lost. It's actually happened. Oh, but that's okay.
Yeah. So he trades the rook. He's going to try and win the B pawn with the knight after the rook trade, which means it's going to be the king's job to stop this pawn. The king is close enough. I guess that's just a technical win for white very clearly. The knight's job is to go to somewhere like A3 and protect this pawn. The king covers the H pawn and black eventually loses.
Now if you play rook H1, then rook D5 gives a check,
to the
and
fifth
B5
rank,
is just lost.
Okay, Hikaru keeps the rooks on the board because that endgame was just too done with the rook trade. So, I mean, we're guessing rook d5 here. King e6, rook
d5
b5.
looks nice. Rook f4 can be also a possibility then to open up this spot for the knight. Rook f4 has been played. He's going for f7 pawn. If you play king g5, then knight e5 check. If you play king e6, then knight d8 check. And you're gonna lose f7 pawn by the knight. And rook stays on the fourth rank to guard b4.
Yeah. Oh, now they're switching to rook d5. The relayers can't decide. Both moves look good.
He played rook f4 first. He played rook f4 first, and he was not sure, and he took this rook back on d4. And then he played rook d5.
It was in his hand?
Yes.
Oh, wow. So not totally confident. Both moves win, or maybe very confident. Wesley's just saying, like, by the way, Hikaru, I could win with this, or I could win with this. That's, time to resign when there's like, 3 different ways to win here.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny to do so. Wow.
All right. He sends the knight to the king's side. Interesting. He might just go after this f7 pawn here even. But I was thinking, Ketty, that like I would just play king f2 here and just say my king's role is to cover the h pawn, and the rook and knight are going to help promote this.
You can't stop it. You can't really stop this rook and knight and the pawn on b5.
Yeah. I think of a lot of these endgames now in terms of roles, like which piece needs to like stop a pass pawn, which piece needs to defend a pass pawn, which piece needs to attack a weakness, and kind of just sort of like figure out who's doing what. So
yeah, rook g1 now is a very smart move. He cuts the g file. Knight g4 has been played, h2.
So like this king position on f4, for example, like I'm not sure I like it, because it's like with that rook g1 move, as you said, cutting it, it's like, is this king helping to stop this pawn? Is it helping to promote this pawn? It's just kind of floating.
Yeah, I saw there before rook g5 at least 3 moves that was losing a game, because rook g4, king g4 and h2 was a threat, and Wesley here kept the rook on h file just to control this pawn, and I'm afraid this pawn is gone now.
So if rook h3, there's rook b1. That's one more trick here. If you drop that b pawn, you've got a lot of work. So
True.
Don't drop it. That's kind of like the roles thing. Like, yeah, he managed to cover the h pawn with the rook, right? But the question is, what are the king and knight doing? If nobody's covering this pawn, then he can't actually take the pawn, even though his rook has trapped it, right?
Was there possibility, David? King g3 and just take it with the king. He gave a check.
Yeah.
How about king g3?
Yeah, king g3 looks like the right idea, using one of these pieces to take this pawn.
Knight f6.
Knight f6. Just showing that he's in charge with a couple random checks.
Oh, wow. King g3, rook to b3. Now, if you take h pawn, I'll take f pawn.
Yeah, and if rook f5, king g6, and the rook doesn't have a way to keep both pawns consistently guarded, I suppose the rook could go to f6 with check and play b6 and just use the knight to hold it. Yeah, that's a construction that could finish the game off here for white. Rook f5 does work, and it's just been played. Wesley's got almost 3 minutes on the clock, so there's no pressure on him here. This is
the dream position Wesley could ever thought today.
Yeah,
it's risk-free, and you have a lot of time. This is still rapid portion, right. 10 seconds, it's just too much. He will never drop the time below like 20 seconds or 30 seconds. Oh no, this is a resignation. Oh, yeah. Wow. This is game over for Hikaru, but it is Wesley who won the third leg.